Our speaker this afternoon is Gordon Neufeld. He's a former 10-year member of the Unification Church. He left that organization in 1986 and went back to university to study creative writing. He has a Master of Fine Arts and is now a freelance writer living in Calgary, Alberta. His most recent book is Heartbreak and Rage, 10 Years Under Sun Myung Moon.
Conference folder, I'm going to speak on writing and on the value of writing for cult survivors. The title is Writing Down the Pain, a case study of the benefits of writing for cult survivors. So the case, of course, is myself. I made a case study of my own experience. So in the introduction, cult survivors are often urged to write down what they remember about their cult experiences as a way of resolving the ongoing harmful effects of those experiences. And yet little has been written about why this is helpful. In this paper, I will demonstrate the benefits of creative expression by providing examples of how it assisted me in my own life. I was a member of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon's Unification Church, popularly known as the Moonies, for 10 years. The Unification Church is the organization legally known as the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity, which was founded in 1954 in Korea by Sun Myung Moon, who is a charismatic evangelist who claims to be the Messiah. In reflecting back on my life during and since my time in the Unification Church, I can definitely say that writing benefited me greatly, not only after I left the cult, but for a period of approximately 6 years prior to my decision to leave. In 1976, the same year I joined the Unification Church, I graduated from the University of British Columbia with an undergraduate degree in English. I had chosen that university specifically because they had a creative writing program. Yet as soon as I got caught up in the Unification Church, which I encountered by chance while passing through San Francisco in August of 1976, I put all my ambitions to be a writer aside. Church leaders, that is Unification Church leaders, told me that when the ideal world came and everyone believed in unificationism, then there would be time for me to develop my writing talents. But in the meantime, I should dedicate myself 100% to carrying out the will of true Father, that is Reverend Moon. So I abruptly stopped writing, and for the next 4 years I wrote only letters to my family, as well as a few fairly prosaic essays for my classes at the Unification Theological Seminary, which is located in upstate New York. So in this article, I've divided the article into 3 parts, and the first part of my article will deal with the period when I had few opportunities for writing. But as I shall relate in more detail later, during my 4th year as a Unificationist, which was also my 2nd year at the seminary, a seemingly innocuous incident suddenly reopened my urge to express myself in ways that put me sharply at odds with the church authorities. For the next 6 years then, until I finally quit the Unification Church, I wrote often, beginning with sermons for the seminary, and then journal and diary entries, and finally articles for 2 grassroots publications that briefly flourished in the mid-1980s. I will be quoting from some of these sources to show how writing helped me clarify the single biggest issue that I felt within myself, the question of whether I should permit myself to feel and express my real feelings, or whether I should obey the demands of the church leaders by completely repressing them. The second part of this article deals with this period of vacillation when I was still a Unificationist, but started to pull away. Even after I finally concluded I could not hold back my real feelings, and therefore I must leave the Unification Church, which I finally did in 1986, the struggle was not over because I still had not settled the question of whether my choice was the right one, the one God wanted me to make. It took another 6 years and a near return to the Unification Church before I settled that question. In the third part of the article then, I will look at the role that writing played in helping me to reconcile myself post-cult to my decision to leave the Unification Church. Ultimately, in fact, it was writing in all its forms, and not just autobiography, but short stories, poems, and a novella, that helped me to be able to see that I had indeed made the right decision by leaving the Unification Church. So, part one, Repression as a Way of Life, 1976 to 1980. Ironically, the reason why I was traveling through California in August of 1976, when I was recruited by the Unification Church, was that I was interested in undergoing Primal Therapy, which is a therapy first described by its inventor, Arthur Janov, in his famous book, The Primal Scream. I had gone to California to investigate not only Janov's original Primal Institute, but also some other organizations that offered imitations of Janov's techniques. And this is ironic because the whole idea behind Janov's therapy is to break through emotional repression. Yet after I got caught up in the Unification Church, I was expected to engage in near total repression of my feelings. Repression, therefore, became a way of life for me throughout the first 4 years of my involvement with Moon's organization. And though I was not aware of this at the time, the thought reform techniques that the Unification Church used on me at the indoctrination camp in Boonville, California, conform in every respect to the 8 criteria for thought reform identified by Robert J. Lifton in his seminal 1961 study, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. The use of these techniques very quickly changed me from a non-religious person into a dedicated believer in Moon and his teachings, the divine principle. I came to believe that my feelings were apt to be invaded by Satan and should be regarded with the utmost suspicion. Instead, I was urged to work frenetically from early in the morning to late at night, to pray and chant constantly during my waking hours, and to fixate all my thoughts on the personage of Reverend Moon and his wife, whom we called the true parents. We were to think only of how to please Father, as we called Moon, and it was presumed that God could not be happy with us unless we expended every effort to serve Father. Members would often counsel each other to just cut from their feelings. And when they said this, they would use a karate chopping gesture to demonstrate the idea, which is similar to the hand chopping gesture that Moon likes to use in his public speeches. Under the pressure of my newly frantic schedule, I stopped writing almost completely, except for occasional letters to my family up in Calgary, Alberta. During my first 4 years as a member of the Unification Church, I was sent all over the United States, first to Los Angeles for what was called the International One World Crusade, then to New York to do recruiting, then to Baltimore and Washington, D.C. to do full-time fundraising, which unificationists call MFT, which means Mobile Fundraising Teams. Such teams would travel all around in vans to sell flowers, candy, and costume jewelry at greatly inflated prices in parking lots or residential neighborhoods and commercial districts. It was during my time on MFT that I experienced emotional repression in its most complete form. Such repression was essential just to survive on the MFT. So this is how I described my own MFT experiences in my new book, Heartbreak and Rage, 10 Years Under Sun Myung Moon. I had finally achieved what Father demanded above all else from his followers. I had become total action without reflection, pure doing. This, in fact, was what Father had in mind when he insisted that seminarians should first go to the MFT. He wanted them to have the experience of totally emptying their minds and of thinking of nothing except obedience to him. Then, later, when they would find themselves in an intellectual environment like the seminary, they would never let mere ideas get in the way of unthinking loyalty and obedience. Only finally, when I was sent to the Unification Theological Seminary in Barrytown, New York, in the fall of 1978, did I experience a kind of a let-up in the demands that the Unification Church placed on me for complete emotional repression. At the seminary, Moon expected his followers to study a variety of religious ideas and systems, and to be able to counter those systems with unification theories that would win their adherents over to Moon's views. In such an environment, there was less insistence on constant, frantic activity, and there was time for students to reflect and to form deeper friendships. At the seminary, to again refer to Lifton's model for thought reform, I experienced a relaxation of milieu control, and although the effect was not instantaneous, by the end of my 2 years in that environment, I had become more favorable to emotional expression and had concluded that repression is not always appropriate, despite what the larger church continued to urge. Many of the other seminary students likewise experienced a gradual loosening up of their mental processes, and for this very reason the seminary was regarded with suspicion and disfavor in other parts of the church, where seminarians had been derisively nicknamed cemeterians. Nevertheless, the seminary continued to enjoy the wholehearted support of Moon himself during this era. In my own case, the change that brought me to this new way of thinking occurred primarily due to the friendship and kindness of another seminary student. So now part 2, vacillating between repression and expression, 1980 to 1986. Late one night in November 1979, after I had been a seminary student for more than a year, a well-meaning young woman, also a Unification Church member and a seminary student, spoke to me. I'd slept briefly that night and then woke up to study from midnight to 4 o'clock a.m. because I could find no other way to keep up with the many demands placed on my time. Because I was a loyal follower of Sun Myung Moon, I felt it would be shameful to even think any complaining thoughts about these extreme demands. Whenever I felt a hint of complaint, I was expected to repress it at once and substitute a feeling of gratitude at how Father had saved me. Like most long-term members, I had become so good at doing this that I had completely lost touch with my own real feelings. I wasn't even aware that I was having a hard time until this well-meaning young woman pointed it out to me. For the purposes of this article and my book, I've called this young woman Fran. That's not her real name. It is important to understand that Fran's act of kindness did not, in one swift stroke, snap the effects of mind control. Mind control should not be regarded as something that is either completely present or totally absent. Rather, mind control persists in a faded form, even in the minds of those who have long since left the totalist environment. And as such, it often causes emotional difficulties for years until it has been identified and resolved. In my own case, Fran unknowingly stumbled across the key to unlocking my real feelings again. Quite simply, she pointed out to me that I was having a hard time, that's what she said, and she offered to be a special friend to help me through this hard time. This was not intended as a romantic proposal. She was simply offering to be my special friend, but I was profoundly touched by her offer. It was so different from the usual advice I received from church leaders, who would generally say something like this: having a hard time? Well, buck up. Think of Father's much greater suffering in the early years of the church. But now, instead of being told to repress my feelings, Fran was asking me to go ahead and feel them, and to talk about them to her. This had the effect of plunging me into a profound turmoil as I tried to decide whether it was truly God's will that I should feel these feelings, or whether God wanted me to lock them away again. If my mission, that is my assigned role in the church, had been anything other than the seminary, I would have been immediately compelled by my church superior to repress all my feelings again. However, because I was at the seminary, where members were expected to wrestle with intellectual questions, I was not compelled. At first, I was so euphoric about the rediscovery of my own real feelings that I set out to spread the word to the entire seminary. Big mistake. I wrote a heartfelt poetic sermon titled Seeking the Oasis, which I first gave to my homiletics class and then to the entire seminary. And I still have a copy of this sermon, and I'm going to quote from the last page, because this is probably the first piece of writing I produced since joining the Unification Church, yet proceeded from my own authentic thoughts and feelings. All we need to do is to find the time and take the risk to bare our hearts to our brothers and sisters. This is a quotation. Our hearts may be as dry and thirsting as the most barren ground without our even knowing it. Replenish them with the nourishing water of your tears, and from the seed of your liberation will sprout the sturdiest tree to give shade and comfort to all who come after you there, with sun-baked, parching lips, seeking the oasis. For the next 6 years, the more I tried to remain loyal to those ideas, the more I found myself being pushed to the fringe of the church and eventually out. Yet throughout this entire time, I remained afraid that I was straying from the straight and narrow, and I continued to struggle with the question of whether I should try to force my feelings back down again. At one point, I even considered voluntarily returning to the MFT. In the summer of 1980, I started a diary, which I call the Boston Diary, because I started it while I was in Boston as part of a contingent of students in the new 3-year divinity program, and these students were expected to return to the seminary that fall. The Boston Diary demonstrates very clearly my divided state of mind as I swung back and forth between my authentic self and what might be called my cult self. This is how I describe the Boston Diary in my new book. I still have this diary, the only one of the many diaries I kept during my Unification Church years that I did not later destroy in a fit of self-reforming zeal. This one was special to me because the entries in it are so heart-rending, so full of lacerating pain and desperate questioning, that I could not bring myself to repudiate it. It is a small book with cream-colored pages, covered with brown cloth, in which I wrote in ballpoint pen, my handwriting sometimes scrawling and expansive, sometimes cramped and mechanical, as I vacillated between the two sides of myself. My inability during that summer in Boston to return to voluntary emotional repression made it almost inevitable that upon my return to the seminary, I would be swiftly shown the door. However, because of the high regard that the Reverend Moon still had for the seminary at that time, I received a different treatment than I might have received if I was just an ordinary member. The usual way to handle members who are having problems is to send them back to a divine principle workshop. And if that doesn't work, they may be placed in a demanding mission like the MFT. And if all else fails, they are simply sent home to their parents. But instead of any of these courses of action, I was allowed to decide for myself what I would do next, as long as the choice included getting away from the seminary as soon as possible. Therefore, I chose to go to Los Angeles in 1980 so I could undertake Arthur Jano's Primal Therapy, the very same therapy that had interested me in 1976. But I was never able to complete the therapy, money reasons. Rather unusually, I remained an active member of the Unification Church throughout the time of my primal therapy treatments, even though that flies in the face of Arthur Jano's general view that religious beliefs are artifacts of repression and that they will fall away after treatment. In fact, I even interrupted my primal therapy treatment so I could participate in the mass wedding that Moon staged at Madison Square Garden in 1982. One might conclude from this that primal therapy was not effective in breaking through my cultic mindset, though this ineffectiveness might simply be due to the fact that I couldn't finish it. It took, therefore, more than 6 years from the day that Fran reawakened my real feelings till I was finally ready to leave the Unification Church. Throughout that interval, I continued to explore my feelings in many journals and diaries, and as well, during the final months of my 10-year membership in the Unification Church, I began to write articles and humorous stories that appeared in the Round Table and in Our Network, which were two grassroots unification publications that sprang up and briefly flourished in the mid-1980s. These two informal publications, or sometimes called zines, were put out by disaffected members of the Unification Church without the consent or approval of their church superiors, and they were mailed free of charge to anyone who requested them. One, the Round Table, this is the first issue of that, was sent out on a monthly or a bi-monthly basis from the New York area. The Round Table was a serious-minded publication which saw itself as trying to spark a reform movement in the Unification Church. Its logo included a drawing of Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church. The other newsletter, Our Network, see how colorful it is, was much more quirky and informal. True to stereotype, this one came out of California. It included cartoons, poetry, and comedy lists among its offerings. For Our Network, I wrote satirical pieces. In one of them, I imagined myself trying to trade in Moon's divine principle at Honest Dave's used theology lot for an alternative belief system. In another, I pictured the world in 2084, after the Unification Church had finally taken over, and I made joking parallels to George Orwell's 1984. My final article for the Round Table bore the title, The Benefits of Repression. I did not intend this title ironically. I was genuinely trying to argue for the benefits of repressing feelings. Yet at the same time, I wanted to put forward the idea, which was considered subversive in the Unification Church, that repressing feelings is not invariably beneficial. Sometimes it's merely a habit, what I could call institutionalized repression. The benefits of repression appeared in the Round Table in November of 1986, the same month I became an ex-member of the Unification Church. Writing that piece had been a last-ditch attempt to try to see things the Church's way, but then I was out. So to many people, the fact that I even wrote those pieces for the Round Table and Our Network is proof that I could not possibly have been under the influence of mind control. I believe, however, that though those writings were written in defiance of the Unification Church hierarchy, I was still very much under the influence of mind control, and these writings were merely the final stages of a prolonged 6-year struggle. Right up to the final month of my cult involvement, the thought of actually leaving the church remained, for me, a terrifying, even unthinkable prospect. Writing helped me throughout the 6 years from 1980 to 1986, while I tried unsuccessfully to reconcile the irreconcilable, the church's insistence on emotional repression with my own insistence on feeling my real feelings. My writings during that period reflected my split personality, since they often tried to endorse both viewpoints. Even though I was terrified of the idea of leaving, it became more and more evident that I was being pushed to the margins of the church by my insistence on staying in touch with my authentic feelings. Pardon me. So part 3, Triumph of Expression over Repression, 1986 to 1992. Following my return to my parents' home and to the city where I grew up, Calgary, Alberta, I had vague plans of applying to study journalism, but I was turned down by the universities to which I applied. While trying to come up with an alternative plan, I took temporary jobs as a clerk typist and later as a word processing operator, since typing was the only skill I still possessed after 10 years in the Unification Church. I got an apartment in downtown Calgary and prepared to settle into a life that seemed to me to be shallow and empty compared to the apocalyptic fervor of my former cult life. But eventually, unhappy with the routine of my fairly ordinary jobs, I sought out a conventional counselor. That is to say, he was not an exit counselor, and he encouraged me to return to my original ambition to become a writer of novels and stories. In 1989, I applied to the well-respected Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing at the University of British Columbia. When I started my first university term in September of 1990, I had no intention of writing about my cult experiences. I felt that my Unification Church involvement was behind me, and I should move on with my life. The first poems and stories that I produced for creative writing classes didn't even touch upon my cult background. However, a professor at UBC urged me to write about my cult experiences, and eventually I obliged him by writing a short story titled Partings, about 2 teenage girls who leave Calgary on a bus trip to California, and after they meet the Moonies, one of them gets caught up in the cult while the other returns home. At the time I wrote that story, I didn't believe that mind control existed, so in order to explain the difference between the two girls' responses to the indoctrination camp, I set the story up so that one girl was more psychologically vulnerable than the other, and it was the emotionally needy one who got drawn in. Later, I wrote another short story in which I sought to recreate, as accurately as possible, a typical day in the life of a fundraiser on the MFT. That story was eventually published in the Baltimore City paper in 1993 under the title, True Father Knows Best. Even though it was written before I understood mind control and therefore contained some logical problems, it remains one of the best things I've ever written about my Unification Church experiences. The story is shot through with the haunting refrain, "There was no time to waste." And it records one very long day in the life of a young man fundraising for the Unification Church in Baltimore. Near the end of his fundraising day, he is given a chance to make an emotional connection to a young woman on his fundraising team who is having problems, but he rebuffs the opportunity because he is afraid of where that could lead. Here are the final paragraphs of that story. Reinhard turned onto the expressway and drove silently for some time. There was a dull strain of tension in the air. Nobody joked. Nobody told an inspiring testimony. The pale wash of the streetlights swept repeatedly over the 7 faces in the van. First Reinhard and Harumi-san, then Hilda, then the brothers. Everyone was thoughtful, or praying, or staring out at the lowering landscape. When he finally spoke, Reinhard looked up at the rearview mirror. Our eyes connected in the glass. His eyes were as gray and cold as I'd ever seen them, and his words were flat and toneless. "Margaret wasn't at her pickup point," he said. "I asked inside the restaurant where she starts her run, and they said she asked for directions to the bus depot. She said she was going back to her family in Chicago. She gave them her flowers and left. When I got to the depot, the bus was already gone." So that was it. Margaret had left. She'd joined the ranks of the unbelievers, the walking dead. To keep Reinhard from noticing the tears that came to my eyes, I put up my hands and began to pray. Only now that she was gone could I finally let myself feel that I loved her. I prayed that she would realize her mistake and come back to the true family. I promised to God that I would work even harder as a heavenly soldier for Father. And then I turned my thoughts to preparing the product for the next day. There was no time to waste. So those stories were good attempts to process my cult experience, but they were both deficient because they were based on the false premise that mind control did not exist and that people joined the Unification Church solely based on emotional needs. However, in 1992, as I was planning a novel that would include a forcible deprogramming, which is a procedure to which I was strongly opposed, I realized that I understood very little about the rationale behind the programming and why anyone might attempt to do this. I decided that even though I had a phobic reaction to the mere idea of reading books by former Unification Church members, I was unlikely to be able to write convincingly about a deprogramming unless I read something about it. So one day I noticed a copy of Stephen Hassan's book, Combating Cult Mind Control, in a bookstore, and after much hesitation, I reluctantly bought it and began to read. And I should mention that my reaction to that book was, "Ooh, that guy." I'd heard about it and I was almost afraid to touch the book. But to my own amazement, I was completely won over by Hassan's arguments. Reading that book opened the floodgates for me. Soon after that, I read Lifton's study of thought reform, and I began to devour all of the published accounts written by former Unification Church members. I realized that mind control was a real thing and that I had personally endured, and I began to recast my writing to take the new understanding into account. It was only after I reached this key understanding that I stopped writing about my cult experiences exclusively in fiction and poetry, and also began writing about them in non-fiction articles for the Vancouver Sun newspaper. Later, when it became clear that no newspaper article or personal essay could answer all the questions people seemed to have about my cult experiences, I decided to write the entire story from start to finish in a book-length memoir. That project eventually became Heartbreak and Rage. So the conclusion. For 12 years, from 1980 to 1992, writing encouraged me to engage in emotional expression in situations where I was inclined to believe that I had an obligation to repress my deepest thoughts and feelings. Now, this is not to say that it is impossible to write entirely from a cultic mindset, but that kind of writing tends to produce propaganda rather than serious literature. Consider the artistic style known as socialist realism, which was once the official style for artists in the former Soviet Union, and then consider how little art of real merit was ever produced using that style. Serious personal writing, by contrast, puts a person back in touch with his or her real feelings, and therefore provides the tools for him or her to escape the maze of cultic thinking and repression. Henrietta Clauser, PhD, in her recent book, With Pen in Hand, The Healing Power of Writing, offers a number of helpful tips for employing writing as an aid to emotional healing. I should display the book. It's a helpful book for people wanting to get into writing. The most helpful suggestion for the purposes of cult survivors is probably the one that appears at the close of chapter 13, in which the struggles of Mike, a Vietnam War veteran, are described. Consider writing a memoir about an important event in your life, not for publication, but for yourself, to name what shaped you, and perhaps to share with a few select close friends and family members. Mike told the people he shared his story with, "If you want to understand me, here it is. This is what I went through." Be honest. Write continuously, without worrying about style or grammar. The more you write, the more you will remember. Just start. So that's it. Now, if there are any questions, I'm here to answer it. If not, I guess we can.
Were you a writer before the pain?
I was mostly an aspiring writer before. I joined the Moonies in 1976, and before that I'd studied some writing and I did a little bit, but it sort of got cut off by being caught in the cult, and I didn't really resume it until later.
You write poetically, feelingly, creatively, warmly, aesthetically. Back home I belong to a writing group, and you have to do a performance of writing to get in.
Yeah, well, I worked on it for a long time. Yes, Andrea, you had your hand up
Do
first.
you feel like your writing has helped you put it behind you? It's been therapeutic enough that the pain is behind you and you can move on, or is it still part of your life?
Well, I think it helps me understand it mostly. And as far as being free from the feelings, they are fading, but no, the feelings are still there to some degree. And I think that's, if you want to be a good writer, especially of fiction, then you sort of have to be in touch with those feelings. But I'm no longer as overwhelmed by them as I was, I suppose, especially during that first phase, 1992, when I first realized that mind control had happened to me. And up to then, I've been defending the Unification Church and saying that, they aren't so bad. And then I just was sort of overwhelmed and thought, oh my gosh, what I was doing back then was harmful, not helpful. And it was quite a distressing change. But I guess that's what I can say about that. Yes, you have a question?
Yes, are there any particular, I guess the word is tricks or skills that you use to organize your ideas, to present them in a way so that people will listen to what you're saying? I guess it's kind of a generic question or large question, but how did you organize your ideas?
Well, for example, for this book, it took me a long time to write that. I used to sit down and pick out a part of my experience and then write down everything I remembered about it, and just wrote it out in longhand 3 or 4 times through, going over it, methodically. Then finally I said, okay, now I understand it. Now I can write about it. So that's one way to go, but that's a rather slow way to go. Probably what is recommended, like I work with writers in Calgary, and they say, write it out fast, then go back and fix it. So that's actually the most recommended way to go. But I admit that for my book, I didn't follow that advice until later. The first half of the book, I wrote it slow, going over it and over it and over it. But I guess in a way, I remembered a lot by doing that.
So let me see if I'm drawing correct inferences here. What might be recommendable would be to take one vignette out of your cultic experience and write that down in detail to draw the conclusions of how it would impact everything else. In other words, this is a typical example of really what it was like. And take one thing, is that correct?
That might work. It depends on what cultic background you came from, because I found that for the Moonies, writing about the Moonies, it's such a different environment from what other people have experienced that they don't get it unless I tell them the whole story. I tried to write some short stories, some personal essays that were just a section of my experience, and it seemed like it would always raise questions that I couldn't fully answer. And so that's why I ended up writing a whole book. I'm still trying to do that, though. I still want to create stories or personal essays that cover one section, but the problem is that people don't quite get what it's like. If they're coming from a non-cultic background, they just don't quite get how you'd get into that state of mind in the first place. So inevitably they ask, okay, how'd you get there, and how'd you get out? Those are always the first two questions I get. So if you're writing about somebody like that story of the guy who's fundraising in Baltimore, the first thing they want to know is, how did he get into that state of mind? And then what happened to him later? But if I was to do that, I'd have to write a novel. So generally, I think your idea could work, but what you will want to do eventually, if you want to process your own cult experiences, you want to draw the whole picture. You want to get the whole picture. So I would suggest it depends on what you want. Are you writing it for yourself? Are you writing it for your friends? Or are you going to perhaps try for publication? Because if you write it just to process the experience, I'd suggest writing it quickly and write the whole story. And then later, if you want to make it ready for publication, you'd probably take a part of it and work it over more thoroughly. Does that solve your problem? Thanks.
Well, I spoke with you earlier,
Yes.
and from hearing you speak, I know that you're a good writer, you're a very good speaker. I mean, the way your words flow, and I read the first page of your book and bought it because yeah, he's a good writer. I'm gonna write this. But I've been trying to write my story out for years, and I shared this with you a little bit. And what happens to me is I start writing, and then it's not so much writer's block. Maybe it's writer's block, but I just all of a sudden I feel the oppression of my experience, and I don't want to go there. So but I'll fight against it anyway, and I'll make myself write, and then it becomes so time-consuming, and I'm kind of obsessive compulsive anyway. I want everything perfect.
Yes.
And it becomes so crazy that in my perfectionism, I end up deleting, writing one paragraph and deleting three, or, it's just a crazy maker. And I know every book that I've ever read on creative writing and every class I've ever taken, you do write your whole experience through, and you don't think about editing it until the end. And yet, for some reason or other, I can't get past that point of editing. It's like I have a hard time going on to this part before that part, and I know you can't answer that in the short amount of time that we have, but the other thing is that in writing it all out, it doesn't necessarily have to be chronological, because you may even, in some part of your book, you may even want to make it so that you're reflecting back to another time to tie it all in. It doesn't have to be day one to the day that you exited to the
Right.
to the day that you recovered. But I don't know if you have any comment on the whole coming up against that, and then you get so exhausted from that and trying so hard to press through it that you put it down and you don't want to pick it up again. You know you have a story there. Find somebody else to write your book.
I don't think there's necessarily one set way to write a book. So if you do find that you just have to go over it before you can move on, well, I've done that too, and that works at times. I find that kind of writing is best for shorter stuff.
Yes.
Like I write book reviews right now for the Calgary Herald, and that's how I do it. I work very thoroughly and slowly, but if you're doing a whole book, you generally want to rush through it. As far as writing not in chronological order, I did have that experience with this book, that I wrote the part about being recruited first, and then I thought, well, wait a minute, people don't know who I was before I got recruited, so I went back and wrote that part. I guess that's valid.
Right.
But was that any help to you?
Yeah. I think I was just wanting to kind of share my frustration. I don't know if anybody else has experienced that frustration. I think every wannabe writer, it faces that writer's block, or whatever you want to call it, where you really, really, really have something to share, and sometimes it comes out so well, and you think, yes, I can do this, but then you keep going, and then you hit that block again, and it's just so hard to get past it. And I know there's no short remedies to overcome.
Join a writer's group, and the
Yes.
other writers will sort of spur you to keep going.
Yes, I've been told that too.
Okay, but I guess you're the next one.
Yes, how do you keep from getting sued by the people that are still in the cult? If you mention, or by your cult leader, you said that they did this. How do you keep out of legal trouble?
Well,
Are there any tricks to that?
I didn't get a lawyer to help me on this. I just went with my gut instinct. I feel that my own true story, they can't touch you for that.
Yes, it's
But-
not true.
But I did change the names of the lesser individuals, like the members that I met on a day-to-day basis, because I thought maybe just to protect them a little better. That's about the only thing I did. And no, they haven't tried to sue me, and I don't think they're going to. For one thing, the Unification Church is sort of changed in the United States. It's not like it was when I was a member. Now they go for PR, and they're mostly looking for allies, so they get ministers to come to a big conference or media people, and Moon seems to have unlimited amounts of money to pay for that. And I think that they tend to dismiss personal accounts like this. Oh, that's just one begrudging member, and Moon has enough money to keep allies on his side anyway, regardless of what I say.
He seems to have enough money to keep his name out of the media as well. It seems like, you never hear about him anymore.
Yeah.
Has the cult been able to transform itself and survive in a different form, or is it actually diminished from what it was when you heard about him all the time?
I'd say more of the first. It's changed, but it's still there, and the cult is probably as threatening as ever. The only difference is that he used to do these recruiting campaigns on the streets of American cities, and then that would get a lot of publicity. And now he does these things behind the scenes. He's bought up a town in Paraguay. He has a vast ranch in Brazil. He has a bank in Uruguay. He has holdings all over the world. I cannot tell you where this money comes from. I don't believe it all comes from the members. In other sessions of this conference, they've talked about deceptive fundraising practices in Japan. So a lot of money did come from Japan, but I still say there's more money going out than he could get even from the Japanese members. And I cannot be sure, but I think maybe there are underworld connections that Moon is working with to have this money, because he's spent more than $1 billion on the Washington Times since he launched it in 1981. It still loses money. It's never made a penny, and he keeps investing in it anyway.
Well, I thought about your trips from here to there, and the plane fare alone, you would think would not be covered by sales of flowers, trinkets, and candy.
No, often I think there were days when I'd make only like $30 or something, and the cost of the gasoline and the travel would be probably as much. So sometimes it wasn't worth it financially. But they always told us it was good training. If you knocked your brains out and made $30. I'm afraid that there is supposed to be another session around this time, and I'm not sure if they're about to come in, but yes, they are.